Good morning, this is Kim Hammer, pastor of Saline Baptist Church out of Tull, community outside of Benton, with your morning devotion. It's going to be taken from the book of Leviticus, beginning with chapters 13, going through 14 and 15. These are chapters that deal with the personal hygiene of an individual and the expectations of what should be done in order for them to keep themselves clean and keep themselves pure. It also deals with some of the issues that they were confronted with as far as infectious diseases, skin diseases, mildew, also bodily discharge of a man or of a woman. Some of these topics are uncomfortable to talk about, just whether you're in the same company or mixed company, either one, but yet it does reveal that God is thorough in everything that He did with regards to wanting the best for our welfare, whether it is for our spiritual welfare for an eternity in heaven, or it's for our physical welfare while living here on earth. And that pertains not only to us as the individual, but it also pertains to those that are around us and that are in society and function around us. We find that a lot of the practices today actually align with the requirements of the Old Testament age. For example, skin diseases, infectious diseases were to be quarantined for 2 weeks. We understand that terminology today with COVID-19 and the requirements that if you test positive, they want you to quarantine for 2 weeks. And we find that this was actually a practice that was done back in the Old Testament days. With regards to mildew in houses or wherever mildew was found, if it was on the surfaces of the house or in the clothing or on the leather, there were plans and there were guidance that was given as to how to deal with it. And in reality, if the cases were so severe, they were to tear the houses down and take it to a designated dump site in order to contain the mildew. And that's really a practice that we do today as well. It just kind of goes to show you that God was way ahead of His time when it came to issues that we deal today, but it also shows that we need to give God some credit that He knew how to handle things and that He wrote the practices for how to deal with it that we comply with even to today. Then we also find that there's a certification of occupancy with the house that had mildew, when the priest would go back in and inspect it. If he would find that it was clean, he would give what we would call today a certificate of occupancy, where they could go in and live in the house again. And the same thing is true with those that were quarantined for health reasons. They were given a release from the priest who substituted as the doctor in that day, and they could go back out into society and they could regain or resume just normal functions. We find that that was one of the main things that was intended to be done, was to create a pathway forward to where people could reacclimate into a normal lifestyle, whether it's out and about dealing with social activities or going to the meeting of the tent, or whether it was just being able to go to work and move about. So they were given a release in order to return to work, having dealt with what it was that caused them to miss work first because of the illness. And then there also was established a payment system, because whenever it is that the individual was clean or the house was declared safe to occupy again, there was a sacrifice that was offered, which substituted for the priest being able to have a steady income of food. And so we find that everybody was taken care of. Now, with regards to this is all dealing with, and this is taken from from chapter 15, talks about a bodily discharge of a man or woman involving bowel issues, men's sexual actions, women's sexual actions, her monthly period. All these topics are covered by God. And while it may be kind of uncomfortable for us to talk about today, God knew it was real issues that people would have to deal with regards to these bodies, and He established some clear guidelines as how the individuals could move from an unclean state into a clean state. It just goes to show that God is very much interested in what happens to these bodies. And that's why when we get sick or something affects our bodies, whether it's being in a house where you're breathing in mildew and getting lung disease, or it's just dealing with the functions of this body and the way they're made by God. God very much is in tune with what's going on, to the point that He wants us to know how to get it fixed and how to protect ourselves and protect others while we go through the process. Now, the whole motivation is in chapter 15 and verse 31. In chapter 15 and verse 31, it says, "You must keep the Israelites separated from everything that makes them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanliness, or for defiling my dwelling place which is among them." The whole intent of God with regards to these chapters and these guidelines given was that he wanted the Israelites to remain clean and to be separated from anything that was unclean. even if that applied to them themselves, God isolated them while they went through a period in order to become clean again so that they could integrate back into society and do what God wanted them to do. And that's part of what the motivation of is that God always wants his people clean, both on the inside out and the outside in. Now, here's just a couple things, because when you read these chapters, some of it gets kind of detailed and down the weeds. It's a little hard to process, but here's just a few things I want you to take away. First of all, there was a process. For whatever the challenge, whatever the illness, whatever the issue was that was being dealt with, there was a process to go about fixing it or to guide you yourself through getting to a positive outcome. There was a means to address it. In other words, for every challenge, there was a solution. It's just a matter of being obedient and following the solutions that were given so you could arrive at the outcomes that you wanted, and that was to be identified as being clean, having come out from underneath that unclean stance. There was a principal person involved that was going to guide you through it. In this case, it was the priest. The priest kind of stood in both as the priest, but also the inspector and also the doctor that would give the guidance. So there was a lot of responsibility early on the priest, but the point is that there was a principal person who was entrusted with the responsibility to help guide others out of an unclean state into a clean state. There was protection for the people. In other words, when you look at the fact that if they had an infectious disease, they were quarantined for the 14 days, this was to provide protection not only to them, but for everybody else around them to stop the disease from spreading. So there was a degree of protection for all people involved. And there was an re-entry process into society, both for acceptance, that as they were additionally identified as unclean and the priest declared them clean, he gave them, being the person that was recognized as the principal person to have the authority to do so, he gave that person freedom in that he gave them a clean bill of title, as we would say today. He labeled them clean so that when they went back out into society, society would accept them and not shun them, so that that person could resume a life of normalcy. And there was no free handouts. I mean, the priest, you had to go and make an offering unto the priest, and that provided for payment for the priest with regards to his food supply, so they could be busy about doing the requirements that God had given them. There was no free handout. Everybody had to contribute, and everybody had to pay for their own way. And it was even a scale that was adjusted so that even the poorest of them would be able to afford this, because maybe they couldn't bring a lamb, but they could bring a pigeon or a dove. So everybody contributed something. I think about that story of the widow's mite. Whenever it was, they, as we would say today, passed the offering plate, and some put in of their abundance, but they didn't give everything they had. This widow, she was poor, but she gave everything she had, setting the example that if your heart is willing, the rest of it takes care of itself. And there was a purpose to it all. There was a purpose to everything that God had written regarding infection diseases, and the purpose was to keep the Israelites clean. God wants his people clean, both from a spiritual perspective, but also from a physical perspective, because when we are clean and healthy, we can be more productive for service to the Lord. So he wants us to stay clean. He wants us to stay healthy. He wants us to take care of ourselves, and he gave us some guidelines and some structure to show us the purpose and the processes in place to do so. Hope that you get a blessing out of this today, and go out and wash your hands and keep yourself clean.